The rain over Busan was a persistent, cold drizzle that turned the neon signs into watery smears of color. It was the kind of evening that felt long, especially for a single father at the end of his shift. Jin Huan held the door of the convenience store open for his daughter, Sumin. She scampered out, clutching a small bag of milk bread, and he followed, the weight of his tool bag a familiar comfort on his shoulder. They walked in comfortable silence, his large hand enveloping hers. Their apartment was in a modest block near the port, an area now dotted with newer, sleeker buildings for the city's visitor residents. His own work was there, fixing environmental systems and broken doors in the interspecies housing. It was good, quiet work that left his mind free, a state he had grown to prefer. Their route home took them past a narrow service alley between two monolithic buildings. A sharp, distressed sound cut through the patter of rain. Not a human sound, but a high, keening chirr like stressed metal. Sumin stopped, her small fingers tightening around his. Appa, what's that? Jin Huan peered into the gloom of the alley. There, wedged between a dumpster and a wall, was a young dragonid girl. Her form was humanoid, but shimmering, opalescent scales dappled her skin where a human would have exposed arms and neck. A pair of leathery, wine-dark wings, small and meant for a child, were folded awkwardly against her back. One was tangled in a nasty snarl of discarded industrial cable and plastic netting that had blown into the alley. The more she pulled, the tighter the cables seemed to bind, biting into the delicate membrane of her wing, her golden eyes, wide with panic, locked onto his. People passed by the alley mouth, humans hurrying home, their glances fleeting and then deliberately looking away. A visitor, especially a distressed one, was often seen as a complication. Sumin looked up at her father, her question clear in her eyes. Jin Huan didn't hesitate. He had spent years fixing things. This was just another thing to fix. Sumin, hold the umbrella for us, he said, his voice calm and low. He slipped the tool bag from his shoulder and placed it on the dry ground under the eaves. He took the umbrella from her and handed it back, now instructing her to hold it over the dragonid girl. He approached slowly, not making sudden moves. It's okay, he said, his tone the same one he used to soothe a frightened Sumin or a skittish cat near the trash bins. I can help. Just try to be still for a moment. The girl, Mikyong, stared at him, her breathing rapid. The rain made her scales slick and the cables slippery. Jin Huan knelt, ignoring the damp seeping into the knees of his work pants. He opened his tool bag and pulled out a pair of heavy-duty cutters and a multi-tool. He examined the tangle. It was a mess, but it had logic. This might pull a little, he warned softly. He didn't ask her name or why she was here. The immediate problem was the cable. He used the cutters to snap the thickest central cord, relieving the main tension. Mikyong flinched at the sound but held still. Then, with careful, precise movements of the multi-tool, he began to tease apart the smaller wires and the gnarly plastic netting. It was slow work. He had to gently lift the edge of her wing, his touch impersonal and focused. He could see where the cable had rubbed the membrane raw. Sumin held the umbrella steady, her small face serious with concentration, providing a small circle of dry space in the wet alley. After several long minutes, the last strand came loose. Mikyong stumbled forward a step, her wing flexing free. She folded it against her back with a wince. She was shivering, from cold or fear or both. Jin Huan stood, his knees popping. He looked at her, then at his own dry jacket. Without a word, he took it off and held it out to her. Here, it's wet out. Mikyong looked at the offered jacket, then at his face, her golden eyes unreadable. Slowly, she took it and pulled it on. It was far too big for her, swallowing her slender frame, but the immediate warmth seemed to surprise her. Thank you, she whispered, the words accented but clear. Are you hurt? Can you fly? Jin Huan asked, practical as ever. Mikyong shook her head. A very human gesture she must have learned. It is sore. Not for flying now. Jin Huan nodded. Where do you need to go? The Enclave, the tall towers by the bay. That's a long walk in this, he said. He repacked his tools. An idea formed, simple and basic. We live close. You can call for someone from our apartment. Get dry first. He looked at Sumin, who gave a small, encouraging nod. Mikyong hesitated, clutching the front of the jacket. The kindness, so straightforward and without demand, was clearly unfamiliar. Finally, she nodded. The three of them walked the last 2 blocks to Jinhwan's apartment building. A human man in his shirt sleeves, a small human girl holding an umbrella, and a young dragonid wrapped in a worn work jacket. The rain continued to fall, washing the city clean, unaware of the small, new connection it had helped to forge in a damp alley. The rain had stopped, leaving the city smelling of wet concrete and salt air. 3 days had passed since the incident in the alley. For Jinhwan, it was just another small moment in a life built around routine. He had come home from work, helped Sumin with her reading homework, and was now sorting laundry in their small living room. Sumin, however, had talked about it more. The dragon girl had captured her imagination. Appa, do you think her wing is better? Sumin asked, not for the first time, looking up from her coloring book. I'm sure it is, Jinhwan said, matching a sock. They have very good doctors in the enclave. A firm knock sounded at the door. It was not the light tap of a neighbor. It was solid and direct. Jinhwan frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. He opened the door. Standing in the hallway was the dragonid girl, Mikyong. She looked different in the dry, dim light of the corridor. Her scales had a softer, pearl-like sheen, and her hair was dark and sleek. She wore simple, functional clothing, but Jinhwan's old jacket was draped neatly over her arm. Her small wings were folded tightly, carefully against her back. She stood very straight, her golden eyes serious. "Hello?" she said. Her voice formal. Sumin had scrambled off the floor and now stood behind her father, peering around his leg with wide, curious eyes. "Hello?" Jinhwan replied, surprised. "Are you okay?" "I am well. My wing is healed." She held out the jacket. "I came to return this, and to thank you, properly." She gave a short, stiff bow. "My mother says thanks must be given with weight, not just words." Jinhwan accepted the jacket. It smelled faintly of a foreign scent, like incense and ozone. "You didn't have to. I'm just glad you're not hurt. My scent memory is good," Mikyong stated, as if explaining a simple fact. "I followed it to this building. The door manager confirmed your name. Kim Yindan." A slight, unfamiliar feeling crept into Jinhwan's chest. It was the feeling of being tracked down. It was unsettling, but the girl's intent seemed purely earnest, not threatening. She was just standing there, waiting. Sumin tugged on his pant leg. He looked down at her hopeful face. "Would you like to come in?" Jinhwan heard himself ask. "For a minute?" Mikyong nodded once. "Yes, thank you." She stepped inside, her movements a little careful, as if afraid to bump into things. Her eyes took in the apartment quickly. The worn but clean sofa, the low table scattered with Sumin's things, the family photos on the wall, the small kitchen. It was all very ordinary, very human. Sumin finally found her voice. "I am Sumin. Do you want to see my room?" Mikyong looked at Jinhwan for permission. He gave a small nod. The two girls disappeared down the short hallway. Jinhwan stood for a moment in the quiet living room. This was unusual, but Sumin seemed happy, and the girl meant no harm. He went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. He could at least offer tea. When he carried 2 cups into the living room, the girls were back. Sumin was showing Mikyong her tablet, scrolling through pictures of animals. Mikyong watched with intense focus, her head tilted. "Would you like some tea?" Jinhwan asked. Mikyong sniffed the air. "What is it?"
Parleitea.
"It's mild." "Okay." She accepted the cup, holding it with both hands, mimicking Jinhwan. She took a cautious sip. Her eyes widened slightly, a flash of surprise that softened her serious expression. "It is warm," she said, which Jinhwan took as approval. Sumin, emboldened, asked, "What's your name?"
Iam Mikyong.
"Do you go to school?" I have tutors in the enclave. We study many things. Earth customs are complex. She looked around the room again, her gaze lingering on a photo of Jean Huan and a smiling woman with Su-min as a baby. Your nest is small, but it feels full. It's just the two of us? Jean Huan said simply. Mi-kyung looked at him, then at Su-min. My mother and I are also too, but our space is large and cold. It is for diplomacy. She said the last word carefully, like it was a lesson she had memorized. An idea occurred to Jean Huan. It was almost dinner time. Su-min, are you hungry? We were going to have hotteok. Su-min cheered. Mi-kyung looked puzzled. It's a sweet food. A pancake, Jean Huan explained. Would you like to try some? Before you go home. Mi-kyung hesitated. Her eyes flicked to the door, then back to Su-min's excited face. The formality seemed to melt from her shoulders, just a little. Yes, she said. I would like to try it. Jean Huan worked in the kitchen, mixing the simple batter. The sounds from the living room were new. Su-min's high, chattering voice and Mi-kyung's lower, more measured replies. He heard Su-min giggle at something. He poured the batter into the pan, the sweet cinnamon smell filling the apartment. When he brought out a plate of the golden, syrup-filled pancakes, the two girls were sitting on the floor by the low table. Mi-kyung watched intently as Su-min showed her how to eat the hot treat without burning her fingers or dripping syrup. Mi-kyung took a small bite. She chewed slowly. Then she took another, larger bite. A quiet, contented hum, almost a purr, vibrated in her throat. This is good, she stated firmly. Very good. Jean Huan sat in his armchair, sipping his tea. He watched as Su-min, with the easy grace of a child, pulled Mi-kyung into her world, showing her toys and drawings. Mi-kyung, for all her otherworldliness, began to ask questions, her curiosity genuine. The last of the evening light faded outside the window, and the warm light of the apartment seemed to wrap around them all. A forgotten feeling, something like quiet contentment, settled in the room. It was just a visit, just some pancakes. But for the first time in a long time, the quiet in Jean Huan's apartment wasn't filled with absence, but with a gentle, unexpected presence. Mi-kyung's visits became a regular part of the week. Every few days after her lessons, she would appear at the apartment door. Jean Huan never asked how she got past the enclave security or the building manager. She just did. Su-min began to look forward to it, her small face lighting up at the familiar, firm knock that Jean Huan found he didn't mind. Mi-kyung was a quiet guest. She would sit, often on the floor because her wings made chairs awkward, and watch. She watched Su-min play. She watched Jean Huan fix a loose shelf or prepare dinner. She asked simple, direct questions. Why do you cut the vegetables so small? Why does that machine make that sound? Why do you have a picture of that flower? Her curiosity was endless. In turn, she shared little things. She explained that the shimmer of her scales changed slightly with her mood. She told them that her people loved high places, and that the tall enclave towers felt a little more like home. She never spoke much about her mother, only referring to her as the diplomat, which sounded lonely to Jean Huan. One rainy Saturday afternoon, the three of them were in the living room. Su-min was teaching Mi-kyung a simple card game on the low table, their heads close together. Jean Huan was on his knees by the radiator, a small toolbox beside him. The valve was leaking, a slow drip-drip into the pan he'd placed underneath. The soft patter of rain on the window mixed with the girls' murmured conversation and the occasional clink of his wrench. Mi-kyung's communicator, a smooth, dark rectangle that looked like polished stone, was lying on the sofa where she had left it. It was the only obviously advanced object in the room. It lit up silently. A soft, pulsing glow came from it. An incoming call. Su-min glanced over. Mi-kyung, your thing is lighting up. Mi-kyung turned, her golden eyes shifting from the cards to the sofa. The caller's identity was displayed on the surface, but it was the image behind it that froze her. It was a photo. A background image on the device's screen. The photo showed two humans, a man and a woman. They were young, perhaps in their late 20s. They stood under a canopy of blooming cherry blossoms, pink flowers a soft blur around them. The woman, beautiful and bright-eyed, was laughing, her head tilted toward the man. The man had his arm around her, smiling a wide, easy smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. The man was Jean Huan, a younger Jean Huan. His face was fuller. His eyes held a light that had since been tempered by loss and long workdays, but it was unmistakably him. The woman was his wife. Unji. Mikyong did not move. Her body went very still, a predator's stillness. Her eyes, wide and confused, traveled from the glowing image on the communicator to the man kneeling by the radiator, his back to her. He was older now, his hair touched with gray, his shoulders carrying a permanent, quiet tiredness. But it was the same man. Sumin, sensing the change, looked at Mikyong's face. "What's wrong?" Jean Huan heard the silence. He turned his head, wrench in hand. "Everything okay?" Mikyong stood up slowly. She walked to the sofa and picked up the communicator. She held it in both hands, staring at the picture. The call eventually stopped, and the screen dimmed slightly, but the photo remained. The room felt suddenly cold. The drip of the radiator valve was loud in the quiet. Mikyong lifted her gaze. She looked directly at Jean Huan, her young face a mask of confusion and dawning shock. Her voice, when it came, was small and thin, stripped of its usual formal certainty. "Jean Huan Assai." "Yes, Mikyong?" She took a step forward. She held up the communicator, turning the screen toward him. The photo of him and Unji, vibrant and full of life, glowed in the dim afternoon light. "Why?" she asked, each word careful and heavy. "Is your photo on my mom's phone case?" The words hung in the air. Jean Huan's world narrowed to the glowing rectangle in her hands. He saw the cherry blossoms. He saw Unji's laughing face. He saw his own forgotten joy. A pain, sharp and fresh as the day it was made, lanced through his chest. He hadn't seen that picture in years. He couldn't even look at the ones on his own walls most days. All the color drained from his face. The wrench slipped from his fingers and clattered on the floor, the sound making Sumin jump. He slowly, stiffly, got to his feet. He couldn't speak. He could only stare at the ghost from his past, glowing on a device from the stars. Sumin looked from her father's pale, stricken face to Mikyong's anxious one. "Appa? What is it?" Jean Huan finally found his voice. It was rough, barely a whisper. "Let me see that." Mikyong crossed the room and handed him the communicator. He took it. His fingers trembled slightly on the cool, alien surface. He zoomed in on the image. It was real. It was the photo from their first wedding anniversary trip to Gyeongju. Private, happy memory. A human memory. He looked at Mikyong, his eyes filled with a storm of questions and old grief. "Your mother," he said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. "You need to ask your mother." The silence in the apartment was a solid thing, pressed on Jean Huan's ears. He held the cool, smooth communicator, his thumb resting on the image of a life that felt like it belonged to another man. Mikyong stood before him, her earlier stillness now replaced by a fine tremor. She had asked a question and the answer had broken the world open. Sumin was the first to move. She walked to her father's side and gently pried the device from his frozen fingers. She looked at the picture, her small face serious. "It's you and Iyama," she said softly. She looked at Mikyong. "That's my mom." Mikyong's golden eyes flickered with confusion. "Your mother? But this is my mother's private case. For her eyes only." Jean Huan took a deep, shuddering breath. The world snapped back into focus, sharp and painful. He knelt down, putting himself on Sumin's level. He took the communicator and placed it carefully on the low table, face down. "Mikyong," he said, his voice strangely calm, like the quiet center of a storm. "You should go home now." "But," she started. "No," he interrupted, gently but firmly. "You need to take this to your mother. You need to ask her your question. Not me." The finality in his tone was something Mikyong had never heard from him. She nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion. She picked up her communicator, clutching it tightly to her chest. She looked at Sumin, who gave her a small, uncertain wave. Without another word, Mikyong turned and walked to the door. She let herself out, closing it with a quiet click. The apartment felt hollow again. The familiar, comfortable quiet now felt like an echo of the silence that had just left. Jin Huan stayed on his knees, staring at the spot where the device had been. Appa! Sumin's voice was small. Why did Mikyong's mom have a picture of you and Iyama? Jin Huan pulled his daughter into a hug, holding her close. He rested his chin on top of her head. I don't know, Sumin. He whispered into her hair. It was the truth. Cold, unsettling truth. I really don't know. The evening passed in a blur. Jin Huan made dinner, but he wasn't hungry. He moved through the routine mechanically, washing dishes, running a bath for Sumin, reading her a story. His mind was elsewhere, tumbling through the past. That specific photo, the Cherry Blossom Festival. It had been on Eunji's old phone. After she was gone, he had transferred all the photos to a private drive and then deleted them from devices. He couldn't bear the daily reminders. How could it have traveled from a lost human phone to the personal device of a dragonid diplomat? Sumin fell asleep quickly, tired from the emotional weight of the day. Jin Huan sat in the dark living room, staring out at the city lights. He felt watched. He felt like a story he didn't know he was part of was unfolding around him. He thought of Mikyong's serious face, her careful questions. He thought of her mother, a figure he had never seen, a powerful diplomat living in the sleek towers, a woman who looked at a picture of him and his dead wife every day. A chill that had nothing to do with the rain crept down his spine. Had they been observed? Studied? Was this some strange alien experiment? The idea was frightening, but it didn't fit. The kindness in Mikyong felt real. The girl's confusion had been genuine. No. The answer was with the mother. Hanul. He realized he was waiting for something to happen. A knock, a call, an explanation from the stars. The ordinary sounds of the building, a distant elevator, a neighbor's TV, seemed loaded with meaning. Every minute stretched out, filled with the ghosts of cherry blossoms and his wife's laugh. He finally stood, his joints stiff. He walked to the small shelf where he kept a few physical photos. He found the one from that same day. It was a different shot, but they were wearing the same clothes, their smiles just as bright. He traced Eunji's face with his finger. What did we do? He asked the silent picture. What did we get involved in? There were no answers in the still image. Only the past, smiling blissfully, unaware of the future it had created. He put the photo back. He checked the locks on the door, a new habit born that night. He looked in on Sumin, sleeping peacefully, her world still intact. For her, the mystery was an adventure. For him, it was a door swinging open on a dark room. He went to bed but did not sleep. He lay awake, listening. The rain had started again, a soft tap-tap against the window. It was the same sound as the day he had helped a strange girl in an alley. That simple act of fixing a problem had led here, to this sleepless night full of questions. He knew one thing for certain. Mikyong would ask her mother, and then something would change. The quiet life he had built, the careful peace he maintained for Sumin, was over. A story from his past, a story he didn't even know was his, was coming back for him. All he could do now was wait for it to arrive. The knock came just past 8 in the evening the next day. It was not Mikyong's firm, familiar tap. This was different. It was slower, heavier, and it seemed to vibrate through the apartment door itself. Jin Huan knew who it was. He had been waiting all day, a tense ball of nerves hidden under his usual calm routine. Sumin looked up from her homework at the low table, her eyes wide. He walked to the door and opened it. A dragonid woman stood in the hallway. She was tall and elegant, her posture perfectly straight. Her scales had a deeper, more metallic sheen than Mikyong's, like polished bronze. Her eyes were the same gold, but they held a weight, a gravity, that her daughter's did not. She wore simple, dark clothes that seemed both formal and functional. This was Hanul, and standing slightly behind her, half hidden by her mother's arm, was Mikyong. The girl looked up at Jin Huan. her expression a mix of fear and desperate curiosity. Kim Jin-hwan, Hanul said. Her voice was lower than he expected, and her Korean was flawless, without any accent. May we enter? We have much to discuss. Jin-hwan stepped back silently, holding the door open. The two of them came inside. The apartment, which had felt too large and empty last night, now felt very small. Hanul's presence filled the space. She glanced around, her gaze lingering on the family photos, on Soo-min, who had now stood up and was clutching her stuffed rabbit. Hanul bowed her head slightly to Soo-min. You must be Soo-min. My daughter has spoken of your kindness. The words were correct, polite, but her voice was tight. Jin-hwan gestured to the sofa. Please sit. Hanul did not sit immediately. She looked at Jin-hwan, really looked at him, her eyes scanning his face as if comparing it to a memory. A profound sadness flickered in her golden eyes. You have aged, she said quietly, almost to herself. But so have we all. Finally, she sat. Mikyong sat rigidly beside her. Jin-hwan sat in his armchair, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. Soo-min came and stood by his side, seeking his hand. You have a picture, Jin-hwan began, his voice rough. From our honeymoon. From Gyeongju. I do, Hanul confirmed. She did not reach for her communicator. She kept her hands folded in her lap. It has been my most private treasure for 12 years. Why? The single word burst from Jin-hwan, carrying all his confusion and fear. How do you have it? Did you watch us? Were we part of some study? Hanul shook her head slowly. No. Nothing so cold. She took a deep breath, as if preparing to lift a great weight. You saved my life. The words hung in the air. What? Jin-hwan whispered. 12 years ago. It was before open first contact. My people were scouting, assessing. My small craft had a critical failure. Crashed in the mountains near Busan in Yurisan. I was injured, trapped in the wreckage. A memory, distant and half-formed, stirred in Jin-hwan's mind. A news report about strange lights. A hiking trip with Eunji. I was there for a day and a night. My distress signal was set to a silent frequency my people could trace, but it would take time. I was weak. Then, on the second morning, I heard voices. Human voices. Jin-hwan's breath caught. He saw it. The early morning mist on the mountain. Eunji's delighted laugh as they found a path covered in bright autumn leaves. You and your wife, Hanul continued, her eyes distant, seeing the past. You found the crash site. You found me. I was terrified. I expected fear, or violence, or panic. She looked directly at him. But your wife, Eunji, she just said, oh, you're hurt. A soft sound escaped Jin-hwan. A half-choked breath. Soo-min squeezed his hand. You pulled me from the wreckage, Hanul said, her voice gaining strength. You used your human first aid kit on my injuries. You made a shelter from a thermal blanket. You shared your water and your food. You stayed with me. For 3 days you hid me, kept me safe, kept my secret. You asked for nothing. You only asked if my people would come for me. Tears were streaming down Jin-hwan's face now. Silent tears for a brave, kind woman who was gone. Eunji. Hanul said the name with gentle care. She talked to me. She told me about her life, about her new husband, about her hopes. She showed me pictures on her phone. She was not afraid. She was curious and good. On the last day, before my recovery team arrived at night, she took that picture. The two of you smiling. She said, so you remember that humans can be friends. Hanul finally reached into a fold of her clothing and drew her communicator. She activated it, and the cherry blossom photo glowed between them. She sent it to me. Private transfer. A gift. I have looked at it every day since. It was the proof I carried to every difficult debate, to every skeptical elder. It was my answer when they asked why we should trust humanity. Because 2 hikers, on their honeymoon, saw a scared, broken creature and chose to help. The apartment was utterly silent. Mikyong stared at her mother, seeing her not as the stern diplomat, but as a young, frightened alien. Sumin looked up at her father with awe. Jinhuan wiped his face with his sleeve. You never said anything. All these years. I honored your privacy. It was your secret to keep. I watched from a distance. I ensured you got the job here in this building after Unji passed. It was stable, safe work. It was the only thanks I could give without revealing myself. Her regal composure finally cracked. Just a little. When Mikyong told me of the kind human who helped her in an alley, who gave her his jacket, who made her sweet pancakes, I felt a fear greater than any I felt in that wreckage. I knew it was you, and I knew my secret was over. She looked at her daughter, then back at Jinhuan. I am sorry, for the shock, for the weight of this. But you asked me why. That is why. My life, my work, my trust in this world. It began with you. The story settled over the room like fine dust. It covered everything, changing the shape of familiar objects. The worn sofa was where a dragonid diplomat sat, carrying a 12-year debt of gratitude. The low table was where a secret from the mountains had finally been laid down. Jinhuan sat in his chair, feeling the weight of a past he had shared with Unji, but had never fully understood. He looked at Hanul. The stern, powerful alien was gone. In her place was a woman who had been young, scared, and saved. He saw the echo of that fear in the way she held her daughter's hand. Mikyong was staring at her mother with new eyes, seeing a story instead of just a parent. You watched over me? Jinhuan finally asked, his voice quiet. The job? That was you? Hanul nodded once. It was a small thing, a recommendation through hidden channels. It was good, honest work. I thought it would give you stability. For Sumin. She said his daughter's name carefully, with respect. A strange feeling rose in Jinhuan's chest. It wasn't anger. It was a dizzying sense of a world much larger and more connected than he had known. His grief for Unji had been a private, lonely thing. Now he saw it had been witnessed. His struggle to build a life after her had been quietly supported from the stars. It was humbling and a little frightening. Why didn't you tell me before? He asked. And say what? Hanul's golden eyes were sad. That I was the alien you once saved? That your wife's kindness shaped galactic policy. It would have been a burden. You had enough. She glanced at Sumin. You both did. Sumin had been listening, her brow furrowed in deep thought. She turned to Hanul. My Yama. She was really brave, wasn't she? A softness touched Hanul's expression, the first real warmth she had shown. She was the bravest human I have ever known. She was not brave because she was not afraid. She was brave because she was kind even when she was afraid. That is a greater thing. Sumin absorbed this, standing a little taller. Jinhuan felt his heart ache. His daughter was learning about her mother from a stranger, but the lesson was true and good. Mikyong found her voice, small in the big silence. So, you knew him? All this time? I knew of him, Hanul corrected gently. I knew he was a good man, because he was the man Unji loved. Now I know he is still that man. She looked at Jinhuan. The man who helps lost girls in alleys. The man who makes a home full of quiet strength. The proof was not just in the past. It is in this room. The HFY moment was not a shout. It was not a battle cry. It was a quiet realization that passed between them all. Humanity's greatness, in this story, was not in its technology or its might. It was in a newlywed couple who chose to help instead of run. It was in a single father who passed that same simple decency to his daughter. It was a chain of kindness, so small its links were almost invisible, yet strong enough to pull a being from another star into their family circle. Jinhuan let out a long, slow breath. The tension that had gripped him since Mikyong's question began to ease. The mystery was solved. The ghost had a name, and it was not a threat. It was an ally he never knew he had. Thank you, he said to Hanul. The words felt too small for all she had said. For telling us. For watching over Sumin. It was my honor, Hanul replied, and she meant it. The formal atmosphere in the room began to thaw. The story was out. It was huge, but it was no longer a wall between them. It was a bridge. "Are you hungry?" Jean Huan heard himself ask. It was the only thing he knew how to do. To offer food, to make a space at his table. Hanul looked surprised. Mikyong's eyes lit up with hope. "We have kimchi jjigae," Sumin offered, naming the stew they had planned for dinner. Hanul looked at her daughter's hopeful face, then at Jean Huan's open, weary expression. The diplomat's mask fell away completely. She looked tired and grateful and human in a way that had nothing to do with biology. "We would like that very much," she said. They moved to the small kitchen table. Jean Huan reheated the stew. He set out 4 bowls, for spoons. It was a simple act, but it felt monumental. They were not a human family and a dragon diplomat anymore. They were 4 people connected by a secret history, now choosing to share a meal. As they ate, the conversation began again, but it was different. It was not about mysteries or the past. Sumin asked Hanul what the stars looked like from her ship. Mikyong asked Jean Huan how to use chopsticks properly for the tofu. The story was not forgotten. It sat with them at the table, but it was no longer a heavy stone. It was the foundation the table stood on. A foundation built on a mountain years ago by 2 kind people who didn't know they were building anything at all. The meal was quiet, but the quiet was comfortable now. It was the sound of people settling into a new truth. Jean Huan watched Hanul carefully taste the stew, her eyes closing for a second as she appreciated the complex, spicy warmth. He watched Mikyong struggle with a slipper piece of tofu, her determination making Sumin giggle. The sound was light, and it lifted something in the room. After they ate, Jean Huan made tea. They moved back to the living room, not to the formal sofa and chair, but to the floor around the low table where Sumin usually played. It felt more equal. Sumin, emboldened by the unraveled mystery, went to the shelf. She brought back the small photo album, the one Jean Huan could hardly ever bring himself to open. She placed it on the table in front of Hanul. "These are more pictures of Iyama," Sumin said, her voice clear and proud. Hanul's hand hesitated over the cover. She looked at Jean Huan for permission. He gave a slow, steady nod. It was time. Hanul opened the album. The first picture was of Unji laughing, her face smudged with flour. "She was making a cake," Jean Huan said, his voice soft. "She was a terrible baker, but she loved trying." Hanul smiled, a real, gentle smile that softened her whole face. "She told me that, on the mountain. She said she wanted to make a cake for your 1-month anniversary but burned it." Jean Huan let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "She did. We ate toast instead." Mikyong leaned in to look. "She is pretty." "She was kind," Jean Huan corrected gently. "The pretty came from the kind." He began to tell stories, small ones. The time Unji tried to learn to rollerblade and hugged a lamppost for an hour. The way she would sing off-key to old songs on the radio. The way she wanted to name Sumin after the first flower she saw in spring. Stories Sumin had heard only in pieces. Stories that had been packed away in grief, like the photos in the album. As he talked, something loosened in his chest. The stories were no longer just his. He was giving them to Sumin, yes, but also to Hanul and Mikyong. They were becoming part of Unji's story too. The lonely weight of memory began to feel shared, and therefore lighter. In turn, Hanul spoke. Not as a diplomat, but as a mother. She told of Mikyong's first attempt to fly, a wobbly hop off a low step in their quarters. She spoke of the challenge of raising a child between 2 worlds, of wanting her to know her own culture but also to be safe and accepted on Earth. "It is why I let her come here," Hanul said, looking at Jean Huan's simple, warm apartment. "I sensed the goodness. I wanted her to know a human home." "It's her home too now," Sumin declared firmly, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. She reached over and took Mikyong's hand. Mikyong's scales shimmered a warmer hue, a sign of contentment. The evening deepened. The rain had stopped completely, and a clean, dark sky was visible through the window. The lights of Busan glittered, and among them, the taller, slender towers of the visitor enclave shone with a cooler, blue-white light. The 4 of them went to the small balcony. squeezing together in the tight space. They looked out at the blended city. Jin Huan stood with a hand on Sumin's shoulder. Hanul stood close, her wing unconsciously curving slightly around Mikyong, who stood next to Sumin. There were no grand plans made, no discussions of the future. There was only the quiet understanding that they were now, in some strange and perfect way, a family. A family built from a crash in the mountains, from a loss, from an alley in the rain, and from a question about a phone case. The humanity, fuck yeah, was not in the past. It was right here. It was in Jin Huan's quiet strength, a strength Hanul had quietly nurtured. It was in Sumin's immediate, generous acceptance. It was in the simple act of sharing photos and stories across the gap between species. Humanity's greatness was its capacity to make family out of the most broken and unexpected pieces. To build a home not from walls, but from shared history and shared food and a shared view of the sky. Mikyong pointed to a bright moving light among the stars, a visitor shuttle coming in to dock. Sumin asked what it was like to ride in one. Perhaps, Hanul said softly, looking at Jin Huan. One day, we could all go to the observation deck, together. The view of your city from there is also very beautiful. Jin Huan looked at his daughter's excited face, at Mikyong's hopeful one, at Hanul's cautious offer. He nodded. We would like that, he said. They stood there a while longer, for silhouettes against the bright city. 2 humans, 2 dragonids, a single dad, a diplomat, and their daughters. The story of a photo had found its end, not with an ending, but with a beginning. The light from the apartment window spilled onto the balcony, a small, warm square of yellow in the vast, cool night, holding them all safely inside.